Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to be looking at Unit 9.7, Resistance to Globalization After 1900. We'll be doing a little skill practice. And our primary learning objective today is to explain various responses to increasing globalization from 1900 to present. And here are the standards that we're looking at today. And even though technically we're still in the cultural realm, I'm very happy to at least be dealing with some economics. Economics is usually less controversial. Really glad to be on the safe side of things again. But, we are dealing with cultural forces still. So let's kind of go ahead and, get into this. In live class today, we spent a decent amount of time going over DBQ exemplars, and providing resources for students who want to check answers and maybe do some practice sourcing and stuff like that. So, when you return back, when you come back to school, there'll be scheduled time slots before and after school where you can meet and go over DBQ questions that you might have. All right, so once we spent a decent amount of time in class on that today, but once we got through that, we dug into this and kind of just got back into, what is the IMF? If we're going to talk about resistance to the IMF, let's just review what the IMF is. So this is the International Monetary Fund. Encourage international trade, reduce poverty, a whole bunch of different activities. We've been talking about this since we talked about the kind of end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. This is Bretton Woods Agreement. This is, up in New Hampshire. This is the establishment of this kind of new world economic order in the post-World War II world. All right, so a lot has changed since its founding. If you look at, if you want to understand why there is reaction to it, I think we need a clear understanding of what they are, what they do, and why somebody would react to it. And so one way to kind of contextualize the rise of the IMF is the American, the American worldview after World War II. And most people are familiar with the United States ideology towards Marxism, socialism in Europe as part of the Cold War as a result of the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan. So, and when you're talking about the IMF, and the IMF is, at least kind of how I generally look at it, is this is the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan for outside of Europe, and of course plenty of IMF funding made its way into Europe as well. But I kind of see this as a larger kind of global initiative to take these Cold War containment ideas, and spread them around the world, right? So, what is the rest of the world, right? And what is the American view? I've used this quote from U.S. General George Marshall before, so keeping in mind that after World War II ends, General Marshall stays in China, and collaborates with the Kuomintang, following the Japanese withdrawal from China. And then, so he has a kind of a unique perspective, and he comes out with this kind of very well-known quote that we are in the middle of a world revolution, and I don't mean communism. The revolution I'm talking about is that of the little, poor people all over the world. They're beginning to learn what there is in life and to learn what they are missing. And so if you take this kind of well-known Marshall quote, he's looking at this transition that is happening around the world, that the world is about to undergo a dramatic shift, and the U.S. needs to have a clear policy, on what to do about that. right? So you get these kind of a couple of views, out of Western Europe and North America, that traditional society, right, small groups, kinship relationships, not self-conscious of the larger world around them, right, religious mysticism, etc. That there's this belief that that the world was seeing a breakdown of these traditional societies that were around. It was undergoing a process of urbanization, and that would simply increase as time went on, and that we are seeing a dramatic shift in labor. This transition away from traditional, peasant labor, that kind of stuff, into an increasingly mobile labor force, right? So, modern world, developed world, right? In the developed world, right? There's kind of a universal model for change. Western societies, they believe that they can steer modernization, they can encourage it, they can shape it, and the primary tool, many believe, is international aid, right? International aid funding. So target these underdeveloped societies, aka using that 1950s era, French demographer generated word, the third world. Target those underdeveloped societies so that you can counter the spread of Marxism, that whole domino theory, prevent that from happening. And we see this in a whole bunch of ways, right? We see this targeting in a whole bunch of ways at this time. So the Green Revolution is part of this, right? The Green Revolution, if you can keep people hungry, you can keep their stomachs full, then they will not revolt. So, you do see, the Green Revolution as part of this larger strategy. But of course, funding infrastructural projects, funding, economic integration into the Western economic world, is another major component of this. All right. So, really what you're talking about here is, when we're talking about the IMF, right? If we're talking about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, you are technically talking about, let me just kind of do this like I would in class, I guess. Just kind of draw a few notes on this. You would think I would have my pens prepared. Yeah, I don't know why I never seem to have pens, but here we go. What we're really talking about here, we're talking about the International Monetary Fund, right, the IMF, right, and the World Bank is connected to. The World Bank is connected to the United Nations, right? There is a connection there between the two, but right, we're really using economics as a way, right, to spread Western, right, and by Western I mean Europe, right, North America, right, economics as a way to spread Western, and let's use a Marxist word here, Antonio Gramsci word there, right, hegemony. All right, so hegemony. So this is right. So using economics to spread Western hegemony. So what does that actually mean? All right. So what does that actually mean? Is you get kind of a couple ways to look at this. So we have this whole Bretton Woods system, right? Bretton Woods system. The IMF / World Bank. All right, so what kind of things are they? What kind of things are they trying to do? And you can kind of look at the criticism that pops up of them to kind of make this kind of stuff aware. So, the criticism of the World Bank is criticizing things that they do, right? So, both the World Bank, they both have a lot of countries, right? But they are dominated by representatives of Western countries, right? And both these institutions tie credit to the adoption of neoliberal policies, like privatization of public enterprise, right? Reduction of private employment, eliminating price controls on basic goods, weakening protections for workers and labor unions, open up international trade, and investment. Right, so let's just kind of hop back and forth and kind of look at what this is. Right, so what does this mean? We are this system ties money, ties money to kind of neoliberal. What in the world does that word mean? New liberal policies, right? So what does that mean? Let's just kind of say, lock, right? Lock-based kind of ideas, right? So let's kind of start off with this, right? This is, things like self-determination, right? Self-determination, aka democracy, right? Or just representation, right? Representation of the population of some kind, right? So some form or some semblance of that. Okay. All right. So there's that, and then we see this privatization of public enterprise, right? Privatization of public enterprise, right? So these are these. We want to just kind of categorize these free market policies. Right, a whole host of free market policies, right? A whole host of free market policies. So privatization, right? Privatization, as opposed to nationalization of industries, right? Privatization, right? Privatization of public enterprises. Okay, so that's another one. Reducing public employment, right? Reducing public employment, right? So I'm just pulling right off from here, right? Eliminate price controls. Eliminate price controls, right? So, eliminating price controls, and let's kind of zoom in on that. All right, so eliminating price controls on essential items, right? On essential items, so things like price ceilings, price floors, right? Those kinds of things, right? So eliminate that on basic essential items within your society. So allow the market, right? Allow market mechanisms to run their course. All right. So just as a little reminder, all you're talking about there is this is kind of basic economics. A long time here. Supply, demand, just allow, supply and demand to set your equilibrium prices. Don't put in artificial price floors, right? Or artificial price ceilings, right? So allow the market to run on essential things, right? On essential essential things within society. I'm sorry, basic within society, right? So basic free market economic reforms, all right? This next one, right? This next one, weakening protections for workers and unions, all right? So weakening protections for unions and workers. Okay, and I guess I'm not really sure what that means. This is so sometimes I hear criticism, without qualifications. So I'm gonna put them down because I'm fully aware that some of my students are much more intelligent than me. So I will concede that. So that being said, what does this mean? Weaken protections for workers and unions. I mean, I guess, does this mean, right to work policies? Maybe, maybe that's what it means, is institute right to work policies. I know right to work is a law in the United States. I just don't know if this applies to countries around the world in which the IMF is giving money to. So I just don't know, you know, what that exactly means within the context of IMF specific policy. All right, so that one's a little more challenging, I think. All right, what else we got here? Open up international trade and investment. All right, so open up international trade and investment. So what does that mean? That means, tariff reduction, right, and allow international investment / ownership. Okay? Are foreign companies allowed to come into your country and operate businesses or buy out businesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So when we're talking about the IMF, right? When we're talking about the IMF, we are talking about, right? So just kind of be really clear on this, all right? We are talking about a way in which Western countries have traditionally spread hegemony, right? Traditionally spread hegemony. You want to kind of, another way to look at it is, I think, if I have that up there or not, if you want the kind of most basic way to look at this is ideology. All right. What is the eventual goal of the IMF and the World Bank is to spread these basic Western ideological beliefs in self-determination, that people should be able to decide, on their own governments, that there should be government accountability to individuals, and that there should be free market policies. Right. So that is what the IMF is, right? The World Bank is. All right. So, you do see some countries that are pushing it away. So in 2008, and I guess if you understand this within the, you need to contextualize this stuff. Like, why are we seeing so many Latin American countries pushing the IMF away in 2008? Part of it probably has to do with the global recession, that global economic crisis that happened, and it's at its worst in 2008. Right, so I'm going to guess debt repayment schedules, were at its worst, and in the case of Hugo Chavez, this was an interesting year in Venezuela. So we see, the election of Chavez, is going to result in the implementation of democratic socialism in Venezuela. So Venezuela in the 90s, pretty wealthy, prosperous country, massive oil reserves, right? So it should be wealthy and profitable. And in the initial years of Venezuela's democratic socialist experiment, things were relatively okay, stability-wise, because the price of oil was pretty high back in the early 2000s. Peaking out, in 2005, 2006, oil was trading for, I'm kind of remembering the stuff off the top of my head from a long time ago. I think I remember hearing oil trading for like $140 a barrel. Whereas today it's less than half of that, 15, 20 years later. Right, so 15 years later, so Venezuela was kind of riding pretty decent with its democratic socialist experiment, while oil prices were at record highs. However, the global economic crisis is going to change that. Demand for oil will drop, and with it, the price per barrel, right, will plummet down into I think it dropped down into like the $30s a barrel at one point, or maybe even lower than that, maybe even into the 20s. It didn't go as bad as it did a year ago when COVID hit. That was a whole other kind of situation. but yeah, so this is an interesting time in 2008 because specifically with Venezuela, it was undergoing a massive economic crisis, and you know, and there's and for Latin American countries, there's kind of the other thing where there really was no alternative that you could really go to when it came to funding. And so it's kind of interesting, right? Kind of see how global economic crisis sometimes pushes pushes countries to do things, and then search for alternatives. So because by 2008 there was beginning to be an alternative, right? There was beginning to be an alternative. So what I'm guessing kind of referring to here, right, is if we can see the IMF as if we can see the IMF as a way to spread American hegemony, American ideology during the Cold War, right? So during the Cold War, right, we have that kind of bipolar view, right? So we have our NATO, just kind of put NATO countries, and then our Warsaw Pact countries, right? We kind of have our two different sides, and you can see both of these are, kind of specific to, Europe and North America, but they're, these countries will influence, right? So these countries will influence, the kind of underdeveloped world. Right? These countries will influence the underdeveloped world in their own ways. And I'm sure there's a kind of an equivalent organization that existed in the Soviet Union. If I read about it, I don't remember it now, and I have no idea. But I do remember reading about things like Cuba, right? And that Cuba floated, Cuba's economy was floated in the 60s into the late 1980s by the Soviet Union. They gave the Soviet Union sugar, and the Soviet Union gave them everything. Everything else, and when the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, you're going to see a massive kind of economic impact on Cuba, and all these kind of other countries, specifically in Latin America, that were dependent on the Soviet Union for their sources of funding and supplies. So there's a kind of an interesting gap. Kind of an interesting gap that exists in world history from 1991 through kind of, let's just say 2000. Who knows when? I guess it's kind of one of those things. I'm sure historical 2020 is going to be able to give us a clearer clearer answer to this. But somewhere in the let's kind of put early 2000s, right? There started to become someone to fill this gap, right? So, there started to be someone to kind of rise up and fill this gap, and you started to see Latin American countries start turning to an alternative source of financing. Right, alternative source of financing other than the World Bank and the IMF, right? So it's kind of interesting because it's kind of in this void time, this 1991 into the early 2000s, that you see some of the most violent resistance to IMF, right, to the IMF policies. So any time that the IMF would meet, and kind of very famous, protests that took place in around the world, and it happens during this little in-between period, right? And when there was no real, alternative to Western financial backing with strings, and that's part of this issue, I guess, is that there was no alternative, and so you're going to see a lot of tension, right? Because of that, you don't really hear about it that much anymore. Right? You don't really hear about them that much anymore because there are viable economic alternatives, right, that are out there. All right, so, but yeah, you can see, right, just kind of the movements tended to be, right, who are the protesters? What are they protesting? Right, they're largely anti-capitalist. They're largely anti-globalization. A lot of environmentalists take part in it as well. Looking at the carbon footprint of the globalization movements, and in the criticisms that you often hear, that Western countries dominate, right? Out of touch with local economies. They don't really care about the individual issues. They're just exploiting the people in those countries. Not real concern with labor protections, right? Corporate interests are being protected, right, above all else. Right, so those are your kind of major criticisms that you will often hear, and so I guess the question then becomes, like, who is now, right? Who is now filling the void? So if we are looking at this, right? So this is versus who, right? This is versus who, and so what is the answer to that? And once again, I mean, I don't, we are way too close to this to get a solid reading on this, on this kind of thing. But for students who kind of come up with this kind of stuff in class, they will often, a lot of them will connect the dots themselves. They'll say things like, weren't we just talking about Belton Road the other day? What is Belton Road, right? And when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, this is one of those things where, I'm on the Brookings Institute site here, and this is one of the things, there's just a lot of analysis going on right now, with this, and there does seem to be some kind of structural organization that is now starting to take shape, and I do kind of like, because I enjoy kind of reading these things, because I'm trying to, I'm trying to kind of figure out for myself, like, what is the structure here? How much is the funding of this coming from just simply private banks, versus, how much of it is state organized and kind of more larger, organizationally organized. Is this an actual alternative to the IMF? Is this a viable alternative, or is this, something that is, kind of localized and contained and focused? And, the kind of perspective I'm starting to kind of get out of this, because they've been talking about, this was 2013 that this thing was first floated. When this, when this thing was first floated, it was, floated as a infrastructure, right? Infrastructure thing. And then you started to hear talk about things like debt traps and stuff like that. And, and I'm sure there's some truth to that as well. But, kind of the more, the more information that kind of comes out of this, you're starting to kind of increasingly see that maybe this is an attempt to, secure resources around the world, right? Secure resources around the world, secure access to vital interests, economic interests around the world, and and if you want to kind of put it into this hegemonic point of view, maybe this is, Belt. Maybe this is the new alternative, Belt and Road. Right, this new Belt and Road. And the thing is kind of the hard thing to understand is that Xi Jinping, in his announcements of this, and from what I could see, and maybe I'm just not seeing it, which is entirely possible, but the United States, when it comes to the IMF, or the West, when it comes in the IMF, we are not really veiled in what we are doing with the IMF and that money, right? We're not shy about or embarrassed about promoting self-determination and democracy and political accountability. We're not shy about promoting that, right? Kind of ideas of basic civil liberties. And we're not shy about promoting ideas of free market economics. Free market economics, until a very short while ago was, undisputed when it came to benefits. raising more people out of poverty than anything else in history, any other form of economic form in all of history. You kind of look at the growth in global wealth, and the rise of the reduction in poverty levels around the world. Free market economics wasn't criticized at all 20 years ago. It was the clear path. But there was no alternative at that point, right? So maybe we need to start looking at Belt and Road as an alternative. I guess the issue, what I'm trying to say though, is that China has not been very clear about what their goals are with this money. What are the initiatives that they are trying to push? What is the ideology, right, that they are trying to push? So I think we can identify a couple things, right? So, right, when it comes to autocracy, you do not have to worry about making democratic reforms in your country. So if you are autocratic, then that's fine. So that's going to be enticing to a lot of rulers around the country, right? That you don't have to worry about instituting any kind of democratic reforms at all, or even the illusion of it. And when it comes to free market policies, this is kind of a more challenging thing, right? So, this is one where I think we're going to have to wait and see on this one. A lot of the countries in which Belt and Road initiatives are taking place in, especially if you look in Africa, but also in Asia, there's plenty of American corporations that are functioning and operating, coexisting, right? And so this one, I just don't really know enough about at this point. I guess I'll continue to read and research on this. But we do start to see starting to take shape here an alternative ideological perspective starting to emerge here. So is this going to be kind of corporatist economics, right? With state controls, right? So our new hybrid, whatever economics this thing is, our corporatist economics with state controls. Is that what it's going to? Is that what it's going to support? I mean, one would assume that if you are an autocratic system, then you're going to try to emulate that which has been so successful in countries like China or others like it in the past. Like Germany in the 30s, for example. All right. So this is one of those things where it's economics, so it's not very exciting or sexy, but it's very, very important. So anyway, some other kind of impacts of globalization, and I kind of spent way too much time on IMF, and I apologize for that. So we will, right? So on my webpage, I did put some things on there. So if you kind of scroll down. Just if you're kind of interested in what this is, right? So this is China's, or this is one of the apps in China used by the Chinese people for their kind of micro blogging, posting, that kind of stuff. So yeah, so if you kind of scroll, I guess if you scrolling down, right? There's some kind of interesting videos here. Just talking about how China censors content. And you even, there's one video here with a tour of the site. So you kind of see what it looks like, kind of doing a little. So let's kind of just watch this for a second.
They could choose to also re-forward posts and post their comment on.
All right, so you can kind of see it there, right? And so you can kind of get a feel for the format, right, of the app. All right. So this is developed as an alternative to Twitter, Facebook, etc., Tumblr. These things are all banned by the Chinese government. It's much larger used app than things like Twitter. This is the most visited website in all of China, right? So used to do a whole host of things, right? That these kinds of things are in the United States. These apps that you're familiar with in the United States, like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, right, stuff like that. All right, so why is Facebook banned and how to access it? Right, I remember teaching about kind of this stuff in the early 2000s, like 2002 and three, and talking about the great firewall of China, China's great firewall. And when the internet was kind of in its infancy still, American companies were in China, and Chinese users could access them. And even kind of very famously, some very well-known American companies even agreed to work with the Chinese government to censor content on it. Google, for example, did catch a lot of negative publicity in the early 2000s because they did work with the Chinese censors to help block content. So I guess when you talk about Google's ability to block content, or YouTube's video to block content today and censor people today, maybe some of their algorithms that they use were developed while they were working with the Chinese government, right, in censoring internet content. So it'd be kind of an interesting little research project to see how much of the censorship technology used today by Google, Twitter, Facebook, was borrowed from the Chinese, right? Because a lot of that initial work in censorship algorithms, right, was created by the Chinese. So I'm going to guess there's probably a connection there, but that would simply be a hypothesis. All right. All right. So, so you can kind of see which American companies, or which companies these aren't all American. Some commonly used Western apps are blocked in China. So as we see, Google, even though Google worked with the Chinese regime, they still got banned. So you kind of scroll through this. Most kids are not too shocking. Number 56 is kind of matches up with what we had read in our Strayer homework, right? If you remember that from your homework. WION, we actually kind of watched that a little. I've actually kind of shown a couple of those videos on my website. That's India news, right? Not the biggest fan of China. All right, another one. Anything kind of stick out here? It should stick out that a Chinese-run corporation, right, which created this app that is commonly used by my students currently. God knows if it'll be in a year from now, probably not. But as of right now, it's still a pretty commonly used app. That app in and of itself is banned in China. Right? So why is that? Right? Why is an app created by a Chinese company banned in China? Interesting. Okay, so, but I guess you should say just because Twitter and Facebook and all those things are banned in China doesn't mean China is not using them. China very famously, uses, they're one of the heaviest international users of Facebook, even though people aren't allowed to use Facebook. So their government bureaucracy is very active on Twitter, on Facebook, as maybe as a form of soft ideological, hegemony. So it's probably the best way to look at it. Is once again, we're kind of drawing ourselves back into culture again, and the use of tech in order to spread cultural hegemony, to spread your ideology. All right. So, but China is very kind of well known around the world, or at least around the Western society, for interfering in elections, trying to manipulate. So there you go. China watchers joke that it's easy to play bingo at government press briefings. You can guess the phrase that will emerge. China, a strong protest against interference in China's domestic affairs. Criticism of unspeakable, sinister intentions and hegemony. Right, accusing someone of having hurt the feelings of 1.3 billion Chinese people. So it is kind of interesting to kind of see, the Twitter wars going on. And of course, today, these days, China not only kind of has tens of thousands, if not more, people working for their government, posting things to try to influence people's points of view and opinions on a variety of topics in countries like the United States and England, in France, right? So they have a whole army of people just doing that covertly. But they also have foreign ministers, right? Members of their kind of state, their equivalent of a State Department. Kind of throwing points of view out there on a variety of topics. Fake news, right? There you go. Xinjiang issue, right? And of course, sometimes our government will re-engage, right? Or in this case here, a former member of our government who is also a current member of our government engaging. Although now that she is a member of the government currently, I have not heard her speak out on this particular issue. Crickets. Okay. All right. So yes. So there you go. The favorite tactic of the Chinese. So yeah. So if you kind of stopped and read those exchanges, right? Well, what is the promise, right? What is the promise? When it comes to receiving money, from this side of things. There's, if you notice, right, there is social stability. All right, there is social stability. Are you seeing people protesting in the streets of Beijing, Shanghai? Right? Are you seeing people protesting in the streets there? Are you seeing government buildings being attacked in those countries? Right? So you are seeing the promise of social stability, right? And so I guess you could maybe, if you want to say that this is kind of the ideology that is now being attached to receiving money from this kind of new source, right? Autocracy, corporatist economy with state controls, right? The ability to make your CEOs of those corporations that are critical of your regime, you can make them disappear. So you don't have to worry about that. I guess we saw that with Russia as well. Right, so that happened in the very early years of Vladimir Putin, right? So the Russian oil oligarchs got taken out one at a time. So it's kind of an interesting, interesting new thing, in the last 20 years, and great social stability, right? Kind of great social stability. China is a very ethnically diverse place. It's a religiously diverse place. There's all kinds of Muslims and there's a sizable Christian minority there. You never hear any issues, right, with regards to religious diversity and ethnic diversity. So there's a promise of social stability, right? Social stability through autocracy. Okay, social stability through freedom of through censorship. All right, so there are promises, right, that are made, and and for a lot of countries, take Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, right? There's a lot of countries where, if you are weighing your options, right, who do you want to take money from? There is now a viable alternative. There is now an alternative that has not existed since 1991. Right, so that Cold War, end of Cold War void that existed when we no longer had that bipolar kind of world thing going on. That now, and I'm sure this is, I'm sure 30, 40 years from now, looking back upon this, This may prove to be, who knows, this may not prove to be it. But there does seem to be an alternative today that did not exist in the past. And whether this will kind of become a new bipolar world, or whether, globalization will get back on the rails is to be seen, right? But I think it is safe to say at currently, globalization, right? The promises of the WTO and this kind of single world economy, these things seem to be on decline or in decline, as does Western liberal ideals seem to be in decline. Democracy is in decline. Autocracy is on the rise. Right, so that is something that we're seeing. So what is the future of globalization? He said maybe it'll make a comeback. Right, maybe it'll make a comeback. We shall see. Right, but I should probably update this. And, I'm sure there's been an interesting shift post-COVID. Of this. I did read yesterday that China is responsible for the production of 27% of CO2 emissions in the world today. So just kind of give you an idea, right, of that. And, kind of interesting, there was, I'm not sure if it's on today's webpage or tomorrow's. Sometimes I put things on my website and I kind of forget. I put it on today's. If you're talking about how China produces 27% of CO2, this gravitas, this kind of WION video, talks about climate change, and they do talk about it in a way that you'll never hear about this in the United States. Or at least you rarely hear about it in the United States, and kind of see if I can show you what they're trying to say. They do show it in kind of data form here. There you go. What they're doing is they're looking at consumption emissions versus production emissions, right? That's kind of what you're seeing there. Talking about the Earth Day meeting, I guess, right? And I'm not sure if they have any kind of better. I thought there was a better infographic. Yeah, here it is, right? And it's kind of looking at, if you're talking about emissions, and I have to kind of see this a lot, when you hear criticisms of things like the Paris Peace Accord or the Paris Climate Accords and the such. You'll often hear people talking about emission reductions and the such, and kind of looking at what the U.S. emissions are and all that kind of stuff. But you don't often hear them talking about this whole consumer versus production, right? Consumer versus production numbers. And this is, I'm just trying to find a good number on here. And I guess I remember seeing it, but it doesn't thumbnail up. I guess I'm not going to be able to see it. Okay, maybe this will have it. So let me just kind of make this bigger. All right, so CO2-based emissions versus annual scale. So yeah, so this is looking at your CO2 emissions, based on what you're doing inside your country, and emissions that are generated for goods that are going to be used for export, right? So you'll often kind of hear as an argument against climate action in the United States that the U.S. does not produce very much CO2 compared to many other countries, relative, per population, that kind of stuff. So that is an argument that is often used. But you're starting to see an argument now coming out of the developing world. You're starting to get an argument that many of the emission numbers that you are seeing in India or China, much of those emissions are outsourced emissions. Those are emissions that are being created to make things for Europe or the United States, but right, they have been outsourced to those countries. So, even though the CO2 is being generated for In that country, it's actually for your country, right? And, if that had not have happened, then, it probably would have been done cleaner because regulations are stricter in countries like the United States. So there's there's some kind of interesting, complicated stuff here. I don't even know how I'm talking about that, but I did. I apologize. All right, so all right, moving on. Many resisted the powerful international lending agencies such as the World Bank and the IMF, imposing free market and pro-business conditions on many poor countries. Right, if they were to qualify for much needed loans, and we can kind of see once again a little summary, widening gap between the global north and the global south. Right, so economically, and obstacles in reforming the world economy in favor of the poor, laying growing disparities among developing countries themselves. Okay, so feel free to pause and read through all that. And that is all for today. So I will see you next time. Sapriati.